Good afternoon, or rather good evening. Welcome to the second research design that we're focusing on. Up to this point, you have had sessions on quantitative research methodologies and the use of quantitative research methods as your chosen designs. And tonight we get to focus on the first aspect of qualitative research. And as always, I will begin the presentation by just giving some definitional insights into some key concepts that relate to qualitative research. And then I will follow that with some insights into the different traditions of qualitative research. And then we will slowly work through some issues around data collection, data analysis, and so forth. I will be turning off my video in a second so that you can focus exclusively on the PowerPoint presentations. And once again, as I've said before, we will email everybody the actual PowerPoint presentation so you are in a position to review it yourself. And as always, with each of my presentations, I put in some additional slides just to give you additional content should you require it outside of this presentation. So those slides I will jump over when the time is right. I will now very quickly share my slide, and welcome to the session on qualitative research methodologies, and this should take about an hour. Right, once again, as I've said, we are looking at qualitative research designs and qualitative data collection methods. And this is presented as a two-part presentation on qualitative methodologies. And this is the first part. So as always, I want to begin with by clarifying the concept that we're discussing and looking at, which in this case is qualitative research. Creswell defines qualitative research as an inquiry process of understanding based on distinct methodological traditions of inquiry that explore a social or human phenomena or human problem. In this, the researcher builds a complex, holistic picture, analyzes words, reports detailed views of informant or participants, and conducts this in a natural setting. Basically, qualitative research is concerned with the analysis of words, analysis of insights and experiences that people go through, but it does all this in narratives rather than in numbers, as is the case with quantitative research. And it seeks to answer difficult why questions, difficult what questions, and difficult how questions. So for the most part, qualitative research is exploratory and descriptive, and it also is interpretative. So it makes interpretations of what it has observed. And often you utilize qualitative research when you're just beginning to understand a phenomena, or if a new perspective is needed in relation to an existing phenomena. So the expectation and global understanding is that in qualitative research, the researcher operates from a point of not knowing and utilizes that process to gain some insight and understanding of the phenomena that they are looking at. By comparison, quantitative research is generally when the important variables are already known and the researcher is just exploring causality above all. So once again, here are some key aspects around qualitative research. It's studied in naturalistic settings, what we mean by that is that in qualitative research, we study things in the natural setting in which that phenomena occurs. So we do not create a laboratory environment or an experimental environment. We basically study things in the space where we find them. We also attempt to interpret phenomena in terms of the meanings that people attribute or extract from that phenomena or that concept that you're interested in. And of course, qualitative research is used specifically when attempting to understand the nature of a specified phenomena. Now, I have mentioned this concept of naturalistic settings, and it is a very key element of qualitative research, and it really relates to or refers to the setting in which the phenomena or the people that you're exploring live in daily. It is important because it is important that we take note and we pay attention to the naturalistic settings, because within qualitative research, the view is that the context under which you understand something matters. So you would find that in qualitative research, this idea of a homogeneous existence between participants is definitely something that goes against qualitative research, because the view is that each person is more than just an individual going through whatever phenomena you're interested in, but they're an individual who are going through that phenomena and are impacted on by who they are, what their context is. So this idea of naturalistic settings is an important consideration within qualitative research. And it's important, before we get into looking at the traditions of qualitative research, to look at some of the beliefs that qualitative researchers hold as being true beliefs about their state of what reality is all about. Firstly, qualitative research is based on an acceptance that there are multiple realities. And by that, we are accepting that different people may go through the same thing, but there may be similarities and differences in how they experience that thing. So this multiplicity, multiplicity is a central component of qualitative research, because it acknowledges that no single experience is objectively experienced by people. It highlights that the subjective experience is indeed the closest to the truth, and because of that, many subjectivities exist, and therefore many truths or many realities are possible. Also, the view of qualitative researchers is that reality is socially constructed and context dependent. Basically, all that we're saying is that what we believe to be true has a lot to do with how we have socially constructed the world that we are operating in. And of course, it also differs on the context in where these things that we are looking at occur. And then once again, unlike quantitative research, qualitative research is not about testing interventions, and it seeks to understand rather than give predictive explanations. And of course, one of the wonderful things about qualitative research is that it may provide you with the necessary foundational information for you to be able to conduct a follow-on quantitative study. So what I mean by this is that if, say, for example, you are exploring a particular phenomenon that is poorly understood, if you do a good qualitative study, you will get a sense of all the different if you do a good qualitative study, you'll get a sense of all the different variables that matter, or the influences that matter, and then those influences can be articulated as variables, which you can now test through quantitative exploration. And of course, qualitative theory, by virtue of its flexibility, may be used as a means by which you can generate new theory, or you can utilize it to extend existing theory. So in summary, we've said it seeks to understand a phenomena. It considers the context as being very important. I have not mentioned this, but I will speak to it. The sampling approaches that are used within qualitative research are non-probability sampling approaches, and the best of which is purposive sampling. Then, in terms of the collection of data, in qualitative research, one collects data until they reach this point that we call data saturation. And data saturation refers to the point at which one's investigation is not revealing any more themes that have not already been expressed. So when I say data saturation, I'm basically saying if you were to interview people about a particular phenomena and you started to realize that all their responses and their insights seem to cover things that you've already heard about in the process of this interviewing, then you can assume that, look, my themes of interest are now saturated. Therefore, I can claim data saturation. Now, usually, qualitative research is very good at describing in detail the process that is undertaken. It also looks at the set of conditions that were in play at the time of a particular investigation occurring. And of course, it gives great detail to the whole experience, that participants are going through. And it holds the view that it is those people who experience something who are best placed to offer insights into it. Then, of course, it identifies themes rather than talking about variables and so forth. Now, what in qualitative research, you may notice that in quantitative research, I spoke about the different designs. I spoke about the experimental design. I spoke about the quasi-experimental design. Then I spoke about the non-experimental design. In qualitative research, there are similar sorts of divisions, which aren't referred to as designs as such, but they're spoken about more in a loose way as traditions. And so the specific traditions or varieties of qualitative research that exist include phenomenological research, they include biographical research, they include grounded theory research, ethnographic research, case study research, narrative analysis, participant action research. And what I would do right now is to walk you through each of these. And the walk or the orientation to each of this is really about overriding principles of each of the different varieties. We will not give too much emphasis on the detail behind the varieties, because that will become self-revealing as you get a good sense of what the more generic understanding is. So we start with the first variety, or the first tradition as they call it. If we were in quantitative research, we would refer to this as the first design. But it is not a language, it is not a term that is used in qualitative research. People will talk about a tradition or a variety of qualitative research. And the first tradition is this biographical study. And basically in the biographical type, of qualitative research, the focus is on studying an individual and his or her experiences as told to the researcher or as found in documents and archival material. So basically, biographical studies are the types of studies where you are studying a human being, an individual. So if you were to carry out an entire study, and that study was on Nelson Mandela, for example, and the entirety of your master's or doctorate was on understanding Nelson Mandela in one shape or form, that would be a biographical study. But there's also a different subtype in biographical study, and that subtype is this whole idea that there is autobiographical research, and autobiographical research is where people do research, but they do research on themselves. Of course, then they would end up with an entire thesis whose focus is the self, and that will start to feel like a diary depending on how articulated it is, and for obvious reasons. That is one of the typologies that is not seen to be appropriate for doctoral study. And of course, the reasons behind this is because it's very difficult to verify, question, or clarify anything that has come from autobiographical work, because the only true assessor is the person who is writing it. So it is a difficult piece of work to assess or measure. Another type of biographical study is life history and oral history. Life history is basically where people do a biographical study, but they study life history as presented in documents, and oral history is studying a person, but doing so through oral formulations and oral feedback and oral submissions that people make about you. Right, so the next typology, which is very common in research, is this, in qualitative research, is this typology that they call phenomenology. And phenomenology is a process of learning and constructing the meaning of human experience through intensive dialogue with persons who are living the experience. The goal of this tradition is to understand the meaning of the experience as it is lived by the participant. So you'll hear people in phenomenology talking about the lived experience. And basically, in essence, phenomenology is interested in insider experiences of a phenomena. So if you were studying something and the way that you studied it was to specifically identify people who've gone through the journey of that phenomena and to ask them and get insights from them, particularly with an understanding that they are experts themselves through experience, that is more likely to feel like a phenomenological study than not. So, and then of course, in phenomenology, the whole issue that we speak about is the meaning that people attribute to things. So it is not just the description, but it is the meaning that individuals have given to their experience, and the acceptance that because they have lived this, their meaning represents an acceptable truth, and probably the most viable truth that there is at the point of you collecting data. People will always try to talk about units of exploration. So in phenomenology, the unit of exploration is the personal insider experience. And basically what that means is that when you read or engage with phenomenological work, you will be able to separate it out from anything else by virtue of the fact that it focuses entirely on the human experiences. It gives highest credence to the lived experience. It gives the highest credence to insider perspectives. In phenomenology, there are two specific things that are notable about phenomenology, and that is There are two types of phenomenology that the literature speaks about, and the literature speaks about descriptive phenomenology, and that is phenomenology where the researcher will work through the work that's being offered to them, but seek to extract descriptions from the insiders about what it is that they're experiencing, and the researcher would write down those descriptions as they are presented. That's descriptive phenomenology. The other type, which is interpretative phenomenology, involves actually hearing the perspectives of those who are traveling the journey, recording them or writing them down, and then actually taking the additional step of doing an interpretation of what you believe is happening. So going beyond just describing it, but doing interpretations. So essentially, these two phenomenologies are subgroups. One describes only, the other describes, analyzes, and interprets. So in phenomenology, there's some important concepts. One is this concept that we call bracketing. And what bracketing is that it really comes from the acknowledgement that people recognize that the researcher brings himself or herself to the research context, and depending on what their personal biases or pre-existing attitudes and views are, they are likely to see and perceive things in a very particular way. So what researchers will do or aim for is to bracket anything that they believe they are, which they believe might influence the way that they see or respond to what the feedback they're getting. So the best way to explain this is if you think of, say, a person who's been a victim of some violent attack. And that same person, if they were to do a study on violence, they might have pre-existing views about perpetrators, pre-existing views about victims, and so forth. And those views may accept how they hear what they hear. And it is at this point where the researcher would engage and work on bracketing their viewpoints so that they basically take note of what it is that they already hold to as the truth. And from that, they would, any data that they collect, they would then explain that data and acknowledge that their own background may have in some way shaped or influenced their interpretation of what it is that they are seeing. So in this process of bracketing, the researcher will use any number of strategies that are out there to identify the personal biases that they hold in relation to this thing that they are studying. And then they would also clarify how they believe that their personal experience and beliefs may color what they hear and how they report what they hear. So similarly, the other additional characteristic in phenomenology is that people sample using non-probability sampling, and usually it is purposive sampling that they use, and we will speak in greater detail about purposive sampling, but it is one of the types of qualitative sampling that exists. And in purposive sampling, basically the researcher chooses only those potential participants who have the characteristics that they feel are related to the phenomena that they're interested in. So it is about how well that individual's attributes meet the area of interest rather than it being a mathematical probability issue. Now, of course, the idea in phenomenology, because of the unit of interest being exploration by virtue of the lived experience, the view is that one would be interested in seeking out. Your sample would look particularly at individuals who are either living or have lived the experience that's being studied. I've already mentioned two types of phenomenology that exist. There's the descriptive type and the interpretative type. Some refer to interpretative phenomenology as hermeneutics, and this is famously described by Heidegger. And you'll notice that these are long-standing references. I will keep this up for a second just to allow you the opportunity to have a quick read through, as these are concepts that I've already described. Right. So you'll notice that the two types of phenomenology that I described there, one is descriptive, the other is interpretative. Descriptive is literally to do with describing your discoveries in the words of those that have spoken to you. Then interpretative is describing, and in addition to that, making interpretations about what you believe was going on when you were being given the feedback that you have. In phenomenology, the data collection can be, or the data that you collect can be written or it can be oral. And then, of course, it allows you to return and clarify the responses that you're getting from your participants. And as I've described already, the measure of whether you have found out all that you can find out is when you reach data saturation, and that's when no new themes appear to be emerging, no matter how much more digging you do in relation to the interviews that you're carrying out. Right, phenomenology in particular has very limited templates on how people should carry out data analysis, but there are some basic principles, and these principles are quite similar throughout the different types of qualitative traditions. But phenomenology has written much more about the rules and nuances that should be followed when one is analyzing data. Of course, there are types of data analysis that are more structured in qualitative research, and these are usually things that involve using some template, and that template, no matter what the template is, it tends to involve the very same sort of things, that the researcher will have a thorough and sensitized reading of the participants' descriptions. They will then use that reading to understand what themes are emerging and how themes shift and are represented differently, so that they can create what is sometimes referred to as thought segments, when actually people are able to respond, and the things that they give back as responses represent answers that sit in different thought entities. And then, of course, you're allowed, or phenomenology would promote that you identify significant phrases or significant positions or thematic positions that are being expressed by your participants. And then, of course, if you're doing interpretative phenomenology, you would describe these things and then distill it further, so you can make interpretations about what the the real underlying or central meaning that comes from your work is all about. As with all methods of data analysis, once you have identified the themes that exist, the next thing is to group them together and try to bring them so that you can understand and start to develop things that have centralized meanings. Once again, as with all phenomenology, the aspiration of phenomenological inquiry is to produce very deep insights and descriptions of the experience, in which, in this example, the experience is focusing explicitly on that lived experience. So next to phenomenology is another tradition of qualitative research, and they call this ethnography. Really, ethnography is concerned with the description and interpretation of a cultural or social group or system, and it tends to focus on scientific description and interpretation of cultural or social groups and systems. And the goal is to understand the natives' view of the world, or the emic view. And what I'm posing here is that basically in ethnography, whatever the topic is that you're looking at would have to be a topic that you have been compelled and made to accept as something that exists because it's part of a cultural or social grouping or system, and you are understanding it as a culture. You are exploring whatever you are exploring more as the behavior or attitudes or actions of a cultural group or a social group or a cultural system or a social system. So if, say, for example, you were studying how policemen work in terms of dealing with particular racial groups, for example, you might decide that, look, the way that policemen respond to different racial groups is not the function of individual police, it is the function of the culture of policing, and you wanted to study it as you want to study the culture of policing, and then you do so as an ethnographic inquirer. And then, of course, you focus on scientifically describing and interpreting what that culture of policing does. And you want to understand things from two perspectives. One perspective is you can either do this and understand it as a native to that culture. So you become an emic or an insider to the culture. So this is where you normally will get studies where individuals study a culture and they do so by entering the culture and pretending to be of that culture. So if you were studying the way police behave and their attitudes towards racial differences, you would yourself become a policeman, hide out with them for a while, and understand that culture as a native of it, like have an insider or emic view. Of course, this can be contrasted with someone who does an ethnographic study but studies the culture as an external or ethic viewer. So typically with ethnography, for you to have a much more confident sense of what it is that you are seeing or experiencing, or so you have a better sense of the culture or the social group you're looking at, this will involve the prolonged exposure or observation of the group or the class or the system or the culture that you're looking at. And of course, the researcher is immersed and normally will get their insights through simple observation by virtue of them being part of the culture, or through interviews that they do with members of that culture. So now, ethnography has particular elements to it which are quite similar to other traditions, but it is interested specifically in describing the world of the people that are being studied. So it speaks of that group of people as a people, as a culture, as a social group, as a social system, rather than as individuals who just happen to be socially together. It also includes cultural, political, economic, institutional, and social relational aspects. So when we talk about the culture of a place, I'm talking about its cultural culture, its political culture, its economic culture, its institutional culture, and social relational cultures that exist. And then, of course, the type of answers that ethnography seeks to provide relate to questions about how cultural knowledge, how norms, how values, and other contextual variables may influence the experiences that people have of a particular form of phenomena. But ultimately, the one thing you should be understand clearly is that ethnography, the unit of interest in ethnography is culture and social groups. Much like I said, the unit of interest in phenomenology was the insider experience. Now, with phenomenology, with ethnography, there's a couple of things that I didn't touch on, which I should mention, that there are some dangers that are associated with ethnography or some advantages. So people will say ethnographic studies are great in that they allow you the opportunity to really delve into the world of the population that you're studying, and sometimes a sustained immersion in a culture will allow you to see things that you would probably not see if you did fleeting interviews with the group. So that's the benefit. Then, of course, there's the challenge that some people who do ethnographic studies will make themselves a native of the population they are studying, but become so engrossed in it that actually they never ever come out of it. So you've seen probably studies where people went to study criminal life, the underworld, and then they go in there and they fall in love with the mafia head's daughter or something, and then they cannot extract themselves. That's typically the sort of problems that are associated with ethnographic research. And that thing that I described of you, where people can no longer differentiate themselves as a researcher from the area and phenomena they're researching, that is sometimes described as going native. Right, so the next tradition that we should speak about is grounded theory. This grounded theory is it's a very dynamic type of tradition in qualitative research because it has been changed over the progression of time, and it continues to expand. It continues to question itself. So some things that were seen to be appropriate in grounded theory 20 years ago are not as appropriate now, and some of the things I tell you now will probably not be as appropriate in the next 10 or 15 years, because the very nature of it is that it's transient and it's changing. Some of it has a lot to do with the characters behind it. So grounded theory as a term and as a research tradition was coined by Glaser and Strauss, whose view was that grounded theory was really about discovering the theory that is implicit in the data. And in simple facts, the way grounded theory works is that it works on the idea that everything that we see around us possesses information, messages, and all sorts of things. And in those messages, the way that particular messages are created, if you study it appropriately and in a sufficiently tame space, you can actually just look at the data and get a sense of the pattern of how things are happening. And from that, you can develop theory. So in actual sense, what it's literally saying is that the data that we see around us is already embedded with potential for theoretical exposition. It's only that if we look at it in particular ways, then only then will we understand the theoretical possibilities that are around. And of course, there are questions where people say, oh, this grounded theory looks like it can be used anywhere and anytime. And that, of course, has been a point of discussion for many. Martin and Turner in 1986 observed that grounded theory is best used when no explicit hypothesis exists to be tested, or when such hypotheses do exist but are too abstract to be tested in a logical, deductive manner. This is where grounded theory is most appropriate. Where researchers have an interesting phenomena without explanation and from which they seek to discover theory from data. So here's something that is a typical example of something that we can look at. For example, one may have an interesting phenomena that they can't explain. You know, the phenomena of, say, human attraction. There are just some people who can get into a crowd and they appear to have that it factor. No matter where you take them, they float out of the crowd and they stand out. They become the most popular person. They are the ones that are chosen first, even in sports that they are not good at. They just generally seem to have it all. And you see that that's an interesting phenomena, that there's this it thing that's going on, but there's no theory to explain what would have caused that person to stand out. And then you would then look at the world and the things that are associated with being that it person. Is it to do with just their physical appearance? Is it to do with their mannerism? Is it to do with their language? Is it to do with this? And from that data, you are able to generate theoretical positions about what the it factor is. So in essence, the data around you has allowed you to generate a theory about a concept that was somewhat poorly theorized before that. So in grounded theory, there's some key concepts that are noteworthy. It's an approach to describe relationships where little is known, or it gives you an opportunity to provide a fresh take on existing knowledge. It also is sometimes described as a method to systematically building integrated sets of concepts or theories, in this case, from systematically obtained data. So you have this intangible phenomena that you're interested in, and you're able to kind of build pockets of theoretical understanding in relation to that phenomena by just looking at the data that coincidentally makes itself available to you. And it's a process of composing knowledge through intimate contact with subjects and the events under study. So if you're studying that it factor that I spoke about, you would look at the events that are being carried, that are occurring, and then of course look at individuals that are associated with this or are exposed to this it factor, and from that you would take that data to develop theoretical understandings. So of course, in grounded theory, the theory that you get will be shaped by the data that's in front of you, and also by the researchers' mode of thinking in terms of how they theorize. So I could literally give you 10 pieces of information, and each of us would come back with 10 different theories about what it is that was going on. So grounded theory appreciates that there's a possibility that this could happen. And in grounded theory, people talk about concepts such as knowledge discovery, knowledge evolution, and emergent relationships. And those are the types of words that are used in grounded theory. In grounded theory, 4 types of grounded theory exist. And these 4 types are have been generated over time by specific types and spaces of theoretical development. So there's what they call feminist grounded theory, which came about around the feminist progression and so forth of actually in the nursing world, but I will speak to that. Then there's grounded theory as in the traditional grounded theory, which is by Barney Glaser, and then there's the Straussian grounded theory, which of course is by Strauss, and then Constructivist grounded theory. And it is important to note that the 2 founders, Glaser and Strauss, who came up with the initial understanding of grounded theory, have over the course of time become divergent from each other, and they hold different positions about it. So it is an interesting story to watch. If you ever have a chance to look at interviews on YouTube and so forth, you can get interviews by Strauss, interviews by Glaser, and you literally watch the story of how they began to think about grounded theory in similar ways, but because of different cultures or characteristics in them, the egos and ways of thinking, they've perceived and understood it in ways that are different. Hence the 4 different types of grounded theory. Basically, this feminist grounded theory is it was initially used really in the world of nurses in the recognition of this kind of bias that exists amongst grown-ups, and that it was really to do with emphasizing that the views of women are heard within the research community, so that and really it was something that came about as a result of feminist theory, and that's the first type of grounded theory. So there may be a number of phenomena that relate to genderization, which have come about as a result of people just observing the data around them and trying to make explanations about the reality that they see, and then turning those explanations into theoretical perspectives. And then, of course, this classical grounded theory is what Barney Glaser has stuck with, and it has a number of principles, and one of them is that it believes that everything that you come across is a form of data, and that it also is a type of grounded theory that can be used in varied qualitative study contexts. And then it talks about the fact that when you develop theory, it can happen at 2 levels, and one is this substantive open level, and one is this theoretical level. The substantive open level is where you really just walk around in a space of a phenomena, constantly just finding pockets of data that you think are meaningful to whatever phenomena you're looking at, and continuing to take in that data. Whereas the theoretical level is when you are now quite clear that this data actually is coming together in a form where it can form some type of theory, and yours is to keep your eyes open so you can watch and see the theory emerge. And of course, this type of grounded theory does not start with a hypothesis, because you are walking around with the view that everything that you see is potential data. So for that reason, you can't have a singular hypothesis. You would probably be found wanting, because at every point you would find that there's disagreement. There's disagreement between one source of data from the other. And then, of course, one of the things with this type of classical grounded theory is that it promotes the idea that you do not do a literature review until after you've developed a substantive theory from this walking around with the data. And the reasoning behind not developing a literature review is, remember, a literature review helps you to pull together all the thinking about a particular topic. It also helps you to prioritize the different competing explanations that exist and so forth. And if that were to be done early, you would find that you would no longer be able to do an open type of coding, because you would be tainted. So this type of the classical grounded theory approach advocates for not doing a literature review until the very, very end of your study. But of course, in scholarly research, you'll find that people will insist that you must always have a literature review as chapter 2 or as early as in your proposal. So all those things do sit squarely in contradiction to Glazer's form of grounded theory. And then, of course, the Straussian grounded theory is of the opposite view, that it actually looks more at using what you see to make deductions about where it's taking you. So not everything that you see can self-generate theoretical positions. In the Straussian type of grounded theory, the view is that as you come across the data, you become more clear about how this data relates to prior research and what theoretical positions exist. And as you proceed more, you focus less on the data that is emerging, but more on the prior research that relates to what you thought you were seeing, and prior knowledge, and so forth. And of course, within this theory, because there's an appreciation of the importance of involving people in the Straussian version of grounded theory, there is support for the literature review to be done at the very, very beginning. Now, constructivist grounded theory, which is the fourth type, is supported by Kathy Shamaz, and it is of the view that concepts are constructed and not discovered. So in as much as you are being exposed to this data, it is not the data that leads you to constructing theories. It's not the discovery of data that is responsible for your theory, but it is your conceptual self that generates theory, albeit at the behest of the data that you've seen. So similarly, there are some characteristics here that are shared with other typologies of grounded theories, and these include the fact that you start with the literature review at the first step. And of course, this idea that it's constructivist is seen as being a mental progression from traditional Glaser and Straussian types of grounded theory. So that is basically what that tradition is. I spoke briefly about grounded theory, and then the next tradition that I promised to look at is this tradition, qualitative tradition that we call the case study. And in case studies, basically a case study is an in-depth investigation of a single entity or a small number of entities. And these may be an individual, it may be a family, it may be a group, an institution, and any similar social unit. And of course, the important unit of exploration here is the case. And so in a case study, the thing is that if you create or identify or describe the subjects that you're looking at in a way that they can be represented as cases, and you carry out a complete research process on that case. So you literally put the case through all the elements of it being researched. Then you are doing that as a case study. Of course, case study is an interesting one because it is people talk about it as a tradition, but when you really look closely at it, you'll discover that it is actually in itself like a bag. It's like a case, in that it carries, it is a way of thinking about conducting a study, but in its own, it can be quantitative or qualitative. So if you decide that you're going to do an in-depth investigation of something and the subjects that you look at, you will refer to as cases. Those cases you can decide to analyze qualitatively, you can decide to analyze quantitatively. And so you find that case study is not typically aligned as being a qualitative tradition because it is also a quantitative design. But in the quantitative, in this case study world, there are 4 basic types of designs for case studies. And I will touch on these, but won't get into them in much detail because you can find out about these through just a quick scan through the internet and so forth. The first type is this single case. And the single case is when you have you are studying certain subjects, you've decided to treat them as cases, and you are going to study them, but you study a single case at a time. Then that is called a single case. Then they talk about holistic cases, single case embedded, multiple case holistics, and multiple case and embedded case studies. And what I have done is that with each of them, basically you will notice, if I take you back very quickly, you'll notice that the 2 words that I used here is embedment and holism. So when we talk about case studies, we talk about them having either being embedded in some shape or form or holistic in another shape or form. So if I describe what holistic means or how it's perceived within the context of case studies and how an embedded design is looked at, then everything else should become much more self-explanatory. So when we talk about holistic designs, we are literally saying that you will treat a case as an entire subject of research on its own. You subject it to the whole range of research processes that you would carry out at a bigger scale. So if, say, for example, I was studying people's views about X, I could call 50 people and study them as a collective group, or I could call 50 people and subject one person to a complete study of their view, then subject the next person to a complete study of their view, complete the next person to a complete study of their view, that would be more likely to be a holistic design. Whereas an embedded design actually is interested in the fact that you may have a case analysis approach to something, but inside that case, there's also opportunity for you to have other units that you call a case. So I will give an example. Say if you were interested in, I will take a current example. We are talking about COVID and all sorts of things, and currently it's issues to do with how people respond to the vaccine. So you may actually say, look, I know that there are 20 hospitals that are giving COVID injections. So I will treat those hospitals as individual cases because I will study them as if they were totally separate and unrelated entities. But within within the hospitals, there will actually be human beings that you are interested in studying. And if you study those human beings as individuals, they too become cases. So you now have case units at the level of the hospitals being treated as cases, but you have people inside the hospitals who are also being seen as cases. So there are cases that are embedded in other cases. And it's that embedment that is described and referred to when we talk about embedded designs. Of course, this is a little bit complicated and needs you to kind of spend a little bit more time focusing. But if you think about the holistic case study versus the embedded case study, and you kind of try to focus on those, all the other subsets of it will become self-explanatory as you progress on and on and on. So the next type of qualitative tradition is this tradition that they call participatory action research. This is a fairly new type of research, and really the goal of it is to engage those people who are affected by your phenomena of interest in some democratic process through which them, as members of the group, will identify a problem, collect and analyze the data relating to that problem, and then formulate solutions to effect social or political transformation. So, as you see, there's the word participatory, which involves participation, then there's action, and then there's research. The first thing that you know from this is that this type of research emphasizes that those subjects that you study must themselves be participating, and they must participate in an action that's related to this research that you're doing. So in essence, if you have a problem that you've identified and you want to study it through participatory action research, you would find that the researcher would democratically approach the community that's affected by the phenomena, spend a fair amount of time looking at the problem with the community so they can identify and specify it properly. Then on the basis of that, they would then collectively engage in a data collection process that involves members of that community and the researcher too collecting data. Then the outputs of that process, they would analyze and develop actions and action strategies based entirely on this collective participatory approach. Of course, the participatory action research, as you can tell from my description up to this point, is not just about fidelity or adherence to specific research. It is about doing action and conscious raising around particular issues. So when you do participatory action research, it is likely that the topic you are looking at is one that has been overlooked and your involvement in it is you are researching it to raise awareness about it in the hope that it will that awareness will be the initial step to behavior change that is needed for the affected community. So, and the idea is that you seek to empower the participants through constructing and using knowledge. So basically, the more a community understands the problem at hand, the better they are, the more likely they are to actually do something constructive about it. Trying to follow explicit research methodologies and processes comes second place to this emerging process where you're collaborating with the affected population to engage in some dialogue that will use evidence appropriately to seek out solutions. So by nature, it really prioritizes collaboration between the researcher and those that the researcher is studying, and it uses that engagement between them to define the problem, to select an approach to understanding the problem, then select the research methods, the analysis of data, and how the findings will be utilized. And it systematically is about accessing and utilizing the voice of a community to plan context appropriate action. And of course, by virtue of the nature of collaboration, the individuals in the affected population are in themselves now acting as researchers. They're equal participants in all phases of the study as far as is possible. And sometimes people have referred to it as community-based action research. It literally has 3 phases, and I will these phases are quite self-explanatory in the way that they are presented, but they need to be shared nonetheless. So the first phase of participatory action research is the look phase, and this is basically where the community and the researcher spend time looking. They look, they get to know each other, they get to understand what the range of problems are, and they define that problem. So through extensive looking and understanding. Then the next phase is the think phase. So they've looked at this issue and they can now define and understand the problem that faces them. And so they make thoughts and generations about what it is that they are looking at and how they are going to respond to it. So then the think phase is also that point where everything that people have seen and their understanding of the problem allows them an opportunity to now devise methodologies that they will use to better understand what's going on and so forth. Then the act phase is when actually their understanding of the problem, their understanding of issues related to the problem becomes a basis for them negotiating particular types of actions that they will evaluate systematically, improve on, and so forth. So there is a research process going on, but the key of participation has occurred. The key that there's action that occurs within the research rather than just using the research as a point of people being looked at as if they're in a glass bowl. Participatory action research actually allows for the researcher to be a meaningful contributor to action. Now, the final example that we're going to look at, the final tradition, is this tradition that they call narrative inquiry or narrative analysis. And this approach in qualitative research focuses on the story as the object of inquiry. You know, we said phenomenology was focused on the insider perspective as the object of inquiry. We said case study was focused on the case. We said that ethnography was focused on the culture or the social group. Narrative inquiry is focused on the story. And it focuses on how individuals make sense of events in their lives. So basically how this approach works is that, or the assumption that it works from is that it is not what I tell you that matters, it is how I tell it to you. So narrative inquiry actually analyzes the nature of the narration rather than the content of it. So if someone were to be asked to speak about a traumatic event, and maybe when they spoke about it, they cried, they had a blunt affect, or they had high intonation, they screamed, they hid, they refused to speak, they spoke by writing. That way that they are communicating, the way that they tell the story, would be what you subject to analysis because it tells you something. This inquiry approach is usually useful when you are talking to populations where people have gone through something that's actually emotionally taxing, and it is the way that they tell you, the way that they speak about it, that really tells you the extent of what it is that was going on. So in this, the narratives and the nature of those narratives is seen as the cultural envelope into which people pour their experiences and relate the importance of what they saw to others. So when they jump up, they relate to you that this was critical. When they don't speak at all, they relate a different type of response. And then, of course, people will say in this form of inquiry, in this form of qualitative research, the basic view is that people most effectively make sense of their worlds and communicate those meanings by constructing and reconstructing their narrations. That when I tell you the story, it is really literally the animation behind it that is more important than the actual content of what I'm saying. So some in the world of narrative analysis, there are subtypes of analysis that occur. Some will talk about linguistic analysis, where you actually assess the pitch, the loudness of what was being said, the apparent stress in the intonation, the general choice of language that people use. Do they swear when they are narrating things to you? And that becomes a form of analysis, but specifically on the language. Then, of course, there's something that they call pedantic dramatism. And this really focuses more on the non-verbals. And they talk about the internal relationships and the tensions that seem to exist between what it is that was seen, the act, the venue where the act occurred, and of course the agent being the individuals in the story, and the purpose that people perceive in relation to this thing that they're narrating. So those are the two types of analysis approaches that exist. There are more than that, but I think pedantic dramatism and linguistic analysis are the the more common ones. And in actual fact, linguistic analysis is by far the most common. And then finally, the very, very last tradition that we look at is this historical research. It's another form of qualitative research, but this is a systematic approach for understanding the past through you collecting, organizing, and critically appraising the facts that relate to historical events. So basically, the goal of historical research is that you bring a light to the past so that you can reflect on how the past can inform future, the way we understand our present circumstances, and the way we plan for the future. And of course, many people in specific disciplines like history, disciplines that are really embedded in this, looking back and using the looking back to guide understanding of the present and the future, they have much more of a chance of using this approach, albeit that it is very rare in other contexts. Now, so that is the session we have. This is the first session on qualitative research. You will join me for the second part when we look at some of the qualitative methods that are out there. Then we look at some of the qualitative data analysis approaches that exist. and we will in turn eventually look at sampling as it relates to qualitative data. Thank you very much. I hope that you found this a useful session. And once again, don't be limited by what you read here. I always say that these sessions are directive tasters where you can press pause on something and go into the internet and read up about it a bit more so that you actually have a true sense of what it is that you are looking at. Right. Okay, so now we take it back up here and we will close off on that. I thank you once again.